The city was alive with flickering streetlights and the distant hum of cars rushing by. It was past midnight, and the wealthy neighborhood of Brookdale was bathed in an eerie quiet, the kind that only the truly privileged could afford. A sleek, black Cadillac Escalade cruised through the streets at a steady pace, its polished exterior reflecting the lights as it moved past the grand, gated mansions. The driver, a tall, well-built black man in his 40s, exuded an air of quiet confidence. He was dressed casually in a dark button-down shirt and slacks, his fingers lightly gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel. As he drove, he barely registered the police cruiser parked in a side alley until its headlights flashed on and the red and blue lights erupted in a blinding swirl. A sigh escaped his lips as he checked his rearview mirror. He had been through this before, too many times. He pulled the Escalade smoothly to the side of the road, resting his hands on the wheel as he waited. Two officers approached the vehicle. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a square jaw and a shaved head, tapped on the driver's side window with the butt of his flashlight. His partner, a younger officer with nervous eyes, stood slightly behind him, his hand resting on his holstered firearm. The driver rolled down his window. "License and registration," the officer demanded without preamble. The driver calmly reached for his wallet and retrieved his identification, along with the vehicle registration from the glove compartment. His movements were deliberate, measured. He knew better than to make any sudden gestures. The officer, Paul Henderson, snatched the documents and scanned them with narrowed eyes. His lips curled slightly. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. The driver met his gaze without flinching. "I was on my way home." Henderson let out a scoff. "Your home? In Brookdale?" The man didn't answer. He simply watched as the officer took a step back, shining his flashlight through the tinted windows of the SUV. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Henderson said, his voice edged with something more aggressive now. The driver exhaled slowly before unlocking the door and stepping out. He was taller than both officers, his posture upright and composed. Henderson gave him a once-over, then turned to his partner. "Search him." The younger officer hesitated. "Sir, we don't have probable cause." "I said, search him." Henderson snapped. The driver clenched his jaw as the officer patted him down. There was nothing to find, of course. But that wasn't the point. This was about power, about making a statement. When the younger officer stepped back, shaking his head, Henderson smirked. Driving an expensive car in the middle of the night? In a rich neighborhood? He leaned in slightly, his breath laced with cheap coffee. "You really expect me to believe you belong here?" The man's patience was wearing thin. "Are we done here, officer?" Henderson's smirk vanished. In a swift motion, he grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back. "You think you're above the law? Ha!" Henderson growled as he shoved the man against the SUV. "You people always think you can get away with anything." The driver winced but remained silent. "I bet you're some drug dealer or a car thief," Henderson continued. "No way you can afford this ride legally." The man didn't resist. He simply turned his head slightly and spoke in a calm, even tone. "You have no idea what you've just done." But Henderson wasn't listening. He had already snapped the cuffs onto the man's wrists and shoved him toward the police cruiser. The holding cell was cold, sterile, the kind of place meant to break a person's spirit. The black man sat calmly on the hard bench, his wrists still aching from the too tight cuffs. The arresting officers lingered outside the cell, occasionally casting glances at him, speaking in hushed tones. Paul Henderson, still riding the high of what he considered a well-executed arrest, leaned against the counter, sipping a stale cup of coffee. His partner, Officer Blake Carter, was noticeably uneasy. "Are you sure about this, Paul?" Carter murmured. "I mean, we didn't find anything on him." "Maybe we should've," Henderson scoffed. "That guy was up to something. No way he's clean." Carter hesitated, then glanced toward the cell. The man inside wasn't panicking. He wasn't shouting about injustice. He wasn't demanding a phone call. He just waited. Something wasn't right. The uneasy silence was shattered when the precinct doors swung open, and several men in dark suits stormed inside. Henderson straightened, frowning as the men flashed their badges. FBI. The tall, imposing man in a dark blue suit approached the front desk. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "We're here for Director Michael Evans." Henderson's coffee slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. His heart pounded as he turned toward the holding cell. The black man, Michael Evans, slowly rose from the bench and stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Henderson stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Director? As in FBI director? The realization hit him like a freight train. He had just racially profiled, detained, and assaulted the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Michael Evans stepped out of the holding cell, his wrists now free thanks to the FBI agents who had arrived to collect him. He rolled his shoulders slightly, as if shaking off an inconvenience, then turned his sharp gaze toward Henderson. "You made quite the impression tonight, Officer Henderson," Evans said, his tone eerily calm. Henderson swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to explain, to deny, but what could he say? The FBI agent standing beside Evans pulled out a folder and handed it to the precinct's captain. "Per the director's request, we will be conducting an internal review of the handling of this case. Effective immediately." The captain, pale and sweating, nodded stiffly. "Of course." Evans took a step closer to Henderson, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "You thought you could treat me like just another nameless black man you could push around," he murmured. "You never once considered that I might be someone who could fight back." Henderson's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of his actions was crushing. Evans straightened. "You'll be hearing from me soon." And with that, he walked out of the precinct, leaving Henderson standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. The news broke within hours. By morning, every major news outlet was running the story. FBI director wrongfully arrested, racially profiled by local police. Henderson's name was plastered across headlines. His mugshot-like employee photo ran on national television. The department was in crisis mode. The mayor held an emergency press conference. The police commissioner released a statement condemning racial bias. And the public? The public was furious. Henderson could already feel his career slipping through his fingers. And this was only the beginning. The headquarters of the FBI was a fortress of glass and steel, standing tall in the heart of Washington, D.C. inside its walls. The weight of the nation's security rested on the shoulders of the men and women who operated within it. Among them, Michael Evans moved with a quiet intensity, his presence commanding attention without the need for raised voices or grand gestures. He sat at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by senior agents, attorneys, and advisors. A thick file lay open in front of him, filled with reports, witness statements, and documents that painted a damning picture of racial bias within the Brookdale Police Department. Michael steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. "What do we have so far?" A younger agent, Agent Sarah Whitmore, cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses. "Officer Paul Henderson has a troubling history, multiple complaints of excessive force, all involving Black or Latino individuals. Every case was either dismissed or quietly settled. No disciplinary action was ever taken." Michael's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only fueled his resolve. Another agent, a grizzled man named David Langley, flipped through the file. "We've also found patterns of racial profiling in the department. Unjustified stops, unlawful searches, officers manipulating reports to justify arrests." He looked up. "It's systemic." Michael nodded slowly. He had known men like Paul Henderson all his life. Men who thrived in a system designed to protect them, who wore their badges like armor while using their power to trample over others. But this time, One of them had made a mistake. They had targeted the wrong man. He closed the file. We're going after them. The room fell silent. Langley leaned forward. Sir, if we push too hard, the department will fight back. They'll call it overreach. Michael met his gaze. Then let them fight. His voice was steel. We're going to make an example of Paul Henderson and everyone who enabled him. If the Brookdale Police Department wants to protect men like him, then we'll hold them all accountable. The decision was made. The storm was about to begin. Paul Henderson sat in his apartment, gripping his whiskey glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The television blared in the background, but he barely heard the words. His own face was plastered on the screen, his name now synonymous with police brutality and racial profiling. His phone buzzed. He picked it up, his throat dry. Yeah, it's me, came the voice of his precinct captain, Harold Tate. We've got a problem. Paul exhaled sharply. You don't say. They're digging, Tate said. FBI's looking into your record. And they're not just stopping with you. They're going through the whole department. I've already had 2 reporters call me asking about excessive force complaints. Paul ran a hand through his buzzed hair, trying to control the rising panic. They can't touch us. We've always covered our tracks. Tate hesitated. Maybe, but Evans isn't just any guy. Paul, he's the goddamn FBI director. He has power, and he's pissed. Paul's stomach twisted. What do we do? Tate's voice dropped to a whisper. We clean house. We make sure there's nothing for them to find. Any files that could be damaging, complaints, reports, make them disappear. Paul nodded instinctively, then froze. And what if they already have something? There was a pause. Then we pray. Michael Evans stood in the records department of the FBI, flipping through a thick manila folder. His team had spent the past 48 hours combing through police reports, witness statements, and internal complaints. What they had found was worse than he had anticipated. Paul Henderson wasn't just a bad cop. He was a predator. He had racked up dozens of excessive force complaints. Body camera footage had gone mysteriously missing after violent arrests. Witnesses had been intimidated into silence. The system had protected him at every turn. Michael turned to Agent Whitmore. I want an official investigation launched. We're making this public. Whitmore hesitated. Sir, if we go public now, the department will do everything they can to bury evidence. Michael's expression was unreadable. Let them try. The press conference was scheduled for that evening. As the cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position, Michael stepped onto the stage. He adjusted his tie, then looked straight into the sea of journalists before him. Good evening, he began. I stand before you not just as the director of the FBI, but as a man who has personally witnessed the failures of our justice system. The room fell silent. He continued, his voice measured but unyielding. 2 nights ago, I was wrongfully detained, searched, and assaulted by an officer who judged me based on the color of my skin. He did not ask who I was. He did not care. He assumed guilt because that is what he has been trained to do. Cameras flashed. Michael's voice hardened. This is not just about me. This is about every black man who has been treated as a suspect first and a citizen second. This is about the countless victims who did not have the privilege of walking away. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. As of today, the FBI is launching a full-scale investigation into the Brookdale Police Department and all officers involved in racially motivated misconduct. This is not a request. This is a reckoning. The press erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras rolled. Headlines were already being written. Paul Henderson, watching from his apartment, felt his world crumbling. The hunter had just become the hunted. Paul sat in the dimly lit precinct, his leg bouncing restlessly. Around him, the mood was tense. Officers whispered in corners, casting wary glances at him. The once confident swagger he had carried was gone. His phone rang. He snatched it up. Yeah. Tate's voice was sharp. They've got files. Paul. Real files. Ones we can't make disappear. Paul's heart pounded. What do they have? Everything. Paul shot up from his chair. No, that's not possible. We covered. They found old body cam footage. Tate interrupted. On a backup server. They've got you on tape. Paul. The beatings. The racial slurs. The intimidation. Paul swore violently. It's over, Tate said grimly. Evans is coming for you. And he's not stopping. Paul clenched his jaw. He had spent years dodging accountability, hiding behind his badge, knowing that the system would always shield him. But for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never felt before. Fear. And for the first time, there was no way out. Paul Henderson had always believed himself to be untouchable. He had spent years in the force learning how to manipulate the system, how to cover his tracks, how to turn paperwork into his own personal shield. But now, as he sat in the precinct, staring at the flickering television screen broadcasting the FBI's press conference, he realized something chilling. The system wasn't protecting him anymore. The air in the precinct was thick with tension. Officers moved around him, whispering under their breath, shooting him nervous or contemptuous glances. Henderson had always carried himself with an air of superiority. He was the cop other officers feared, the one who got things done, no matter what. But now, he could feel it shifting. They were waiting for the inevitable. His phone buzzed again. Another call from Captain Tate. He ignored it. What was the point? He knew what Tate was going to say. That the department was cutting ties with him. That he was being made the scapegoat. That his career was over. He clenched his jaw. No, he refused to go down like this. He had worked too hard. Sacrificed too much to let some bureaucratic bastard like Michael Evans tear his life apart. Standing abruptly, he stormed toward his locker, ignoring the eyes following him. He yanked it open and pulled out his belongings, his badge, his gun, his backup phone. If they wanted a fight, he was going to give them one. In the dimly lit confines of the FBI's secure evidence facility, Agent Sarah Whitmore scrolled through the retrieved bodycam footage on her monitor. Her brows furrowed in concentration. The files had been buried deep within an encrypted server. Long thought deleted, but nothing ever truly disappeared in the digital age. She pressed play. The footage was grainy but clear enough. A young black man lay on the pavement, his face bloodied, his breath ragged. Paul Henderson's voice rang out, slurred slightly, his body swaying in the frame. You think I give a damn about your rights? The man tried to lift his head, only for Henderson to slam his boot down onto his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. Maybe if you people learned how to act right, you wouldn't end up like this. Whitmore's stomach twisted. She had seen a lot during her career, but there was something particularly vile about Henderson's voice, the smugness, the ease with which he spoke as though he were untouchable. She fast-forwarded through more clips. Henderson, dragging a teenage boy into an alleyway, his nightstick swinging. Henderson, laughing as he shoved a man's face into the hood of a car. Henderson, looking directly into the camera after a particularly brutal arrest and muttering, "They won't believe you. They never do." Whitmore exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against her temple. They had enough. More than enough. She turned in her chair just as Michael Evans stepped into the room, his face unreadable. "We're ready," she said quietly. Evans nodded. "Good. Release it." Whitmore hesitated. "Are you sure? This is damning. His entire department." "We release it," Evans said, his voice firm. "No more cover-ups. No more shields. They made their choices. Now they live with them." And just like that, Henderson's fate was sealed. By the time Paul Henderson stepped out of his apartment the next morning, the world had changed. His name wasn't just in the headlines anymore. It was everywhere. The footage had gone viral. News anchors dissected every second of his recorded brutality. Protesters gathered outside the police station, chanting his name not in support, but in anger. Social media exploded with calls for his immediate arrest. His neighbors stared as he walked past them, their eyes filled with disgust. One woman actually spat on the ground when she saw him. Henderson clenched his fists, his heart pounding. His phone rang, and he almost didn't answer, but something told him to. Paul. Tate's voice was tight, controlled. You need to turn yourself in. Henderson let out a sharp laugh. You think I'm just going to walk into a jail cell? You don't have a choice. The hell I don't. There was a pause. Then Tate said, They're coming for you, Paul. Henderson felt a chill crawl up his spine. He looked down the street. Sure enough, 2 black SUVs were parked a block away, unmarked but unmistakable. The FBI was watching him. Henderson drove with white-knuckled hands gripping the wheel, his mind racing. He had always known the system. He had always played within its rules, twisting them to his advantage. But now, it had turned against him, and he was running out of moves. His only option was to disappear. He had money stashed away, cash he had skimmed off busts, fines he had collected off the books. It was enough to get him out of the country if he could just make it to the airport. His pulse thundered in his ears as he weaved through traffic. He knew he was being followed. The black SUVs had been trailing him for miles, never getting too close but never letting him out of their sight. He needed a plan. Fast. He turned sharply onto a side road, tires screeching. If he could shake them, get to his stash, he might have a chance. The moment he rounded the corner, his world exploded in flashing lights. Police cars, barricades, armed officers standing with their weapons drawn. They had anticipated his move. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. Paul Henderson, step out of the vehicle with your hands up. Henderson's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. He looked around, searching for an escape route, but there was none. Trapped, like a cornered animal. For the first time in his life, he felt what so many of his victims had felt before. Powerless. He reached for his gun out of instinct, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the grip. If he was going down, he wasn't going down without a fight. But then he caught sight of Michael Evans, standing at the edge of the barricade, arms crossed, eyes locked onto his. There was no anger in Evans' face, no satisfaction, only certainty. Henderson's hand fell away from the gun. His breath hitched. The weight of everything, the years of unchecked brutality, the arrogance, the belief that he was untouchable, came crashing down on him at once. He opened the door. He stepped out. He raised his hands. And for the first time in his life, Paul Henderson finally understood what it meant to lose. Paul Henderson sat in the back of the armored transport vehicle, his wrists shackled together with cold steel. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt was the only sound in the otherwise suffocating silence. He stared at the dull metal walls around him, his mind a storm of rage, regret, and fear. The world outside had turned against him overnight. The moment he had stepped out of his car, hands raised, surrendering to the same system he had once manipulated. He knew that he was no longer the predator. He was prey. Through the small, grated window in the back of the vehicle, he could see the flashing lights of police cruisers and FBI escort cars. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a public spectacle. They wanted to make an example out of him. His jaw clenched. It should have never come to this. A voice crackled through the radio mounted near the ceiling. We're 5 minutes out. One of the 2 armed marshals sitting across from him gave a curt nod. Paul could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment, their barely concealed contempt. It was strange. In all his years as a cop, he had transported dozens of criminals in this very same manner. He had sat where these marshals now Saturday watching over handcuffed men. Men who had made bad choices. Men who thought they were untouchable just like he had. The irony burned. The transport vehicle pulled into the underground entrance of the Federal Detention Center. As the doors were unlatched, bright fluorescent lights poured into the compartment, momentarily blinding him. Get up, one of the marshals ordered. Paul hesitated for a fraction of a second before swinging his legs around and stepping down onto the cold concrete. He kept his shoulders squared, his head high, but he could feel the invisible weight pressing down on him. He had been on the other side of this process too many times not to know what was coming next. Processing, mugshots, fingerprints, the stripping away of identity, layer by layer, until all that remained was a prisoner. A nobody. The doors ahead of him opened, and he stepped inside. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled with reporters, activists, former victims, and police officers, both those who had worked alongside Paul Henderson and those who had despised him from the beginning. At the center of it all, standing behind the prosecution's table, was Michael Evans. He hadn't come as the director of the FBI today. He had come as a witness. The nation was watching. This was more than just the trial of one officer. It was an indictment of the entire system. Paul sat at the defendant's table, his face stoic, his hands clasped together. He was dressed in a dark suit, but no matter how polished he looked, he couldn't shake the reality of where he was. The chains around his ankles were hidden beneath the table, but he could feel them. The trial had barely begun, and already, the prosecution was relentless. They played the body cam footage, over and over. They brought forward witnesses, people Paul had brutalized, people who had been too afraid to speak until now. A mother whose son had been beaten unconscious. A teenage girl whose father had been arrested without cause. A young black man who had been falsely accused, humiliated, and left on the side of the road, bloodied and broken. Each testimony chipped away at the walls Paul had built around himself. And then Michael Evans took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. When Officer Paul Henderson pulled me over that night, he didn't see a man. He didn't see a citizen. He saw a color, Evans said, his voice calm but firm. Paul's hands clenched into fists. Evans continued, his piercing gaze never leaving Paul's. He treated me the way he has treated countless others before me, with aggression, with cruelty, with disdain. But this time, he made a mistake. This time, he picked the wrong man. Paul could feel the walls closing in. He had spent years building his own reality, convincing himself that what he did was necessary, that the world needed men like him to keep order. But as he sat there, listening to the evidence against him, watching the faces of those he had hurt, he realized something. The world didn't need him, and soon, he would be gone from it. The jury was out for only 3 hours. Paul sat motionless as the judge called the court to order. His attorney whispered something to him, but the words didn't register. His heart pounded in his ears. The judge turned to the jury foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor. Paul's breath caught in his throat. The courtroom was silent. The foreman stood, unfolding the paper in his hands. On the charge of excessive use of force resulting in bodily harm, guilty. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The foreman continued. On the charge of false imprisonment, guilty. Paul's fingers curled into the fabric of his pants. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. The air left his lungs. The judge nodded solemnly. Thank you. The court will now proceed with sentencing. Paul barely heard the rest. The reality of his fate settled over him like a suffocating weight. His entire life had been built on power. Now, he had none. He was just another prisoner waiting for his sentence. Paul Henderson stood in his prison jumpsuit, staring at himself in the small, grimy mirror of his new reality. The bruises on his face were fresh, welcoming gifts from the inmates who had recognized him. There was no badge here to protect him, no department willing to cover for his sins. He was just another prisoner. He had thought he was different, that he was above the men who rotted away in these cells. But he wasn't. He was them now. The days blurred together. The guards treated him with open contempt. The inmates saw him as prey. The nights were the worst. Lying on a thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, knowing that he would never leave this place. Michael Evans had been right. He had made a mistake. A fatal one one he would never escape. And for the first time in his life, Paul Henderson understood what true justice felt like. Paul Henderson had always believed that prison was for criminals, murderers, drug dealers, thieves. He had never once considered that one day he would be the one wearing an orange jumpsuit, walking in chains, surrounded by the very men he had once locked away. The air inside Danforth Federal Penitentiary was thick with unspoken rules. The guards controlled the schedule, but the inmates controlled the world within. Paul had spent years commanding authority with just his badge and his gun. But here, those meant nothing. The moment he stepped into the prison yard for the first time, he knew he was marked. A group of inmates eyed him from across the yard, their conversations pausing as they whispered to each other. Paul recognized a few of them, men he had personally arrested, men who had once sat in an interrogation room while he smirked across the table. Now, there was no table between them, no badge to protect him. He kept his head down and sat on a bench in the corner, trying to make himself as unnoticeable as possible. It didn't matter. Two men approached him. One was tall, muscular, with a jagged scar running from his temple down to his cheek. The other was stockier, with tattoos covering every inch of his arms and neck. Paul tensed, his instincts flaring. Well, the taller man drawled. Look who finally joined the real world. Paul said nothing. The shorter man grinned. You remember me, don't you? Paul did. He had beaten this man nearly unconscious during a routine arrest. He had never even bothered to learn his name. Now, the man was smiling. We got a score to settle, the inmate said. You made my life hell out there. Guess what? We're gonna return the favor. Paul braced himself. The first punch sent him sprawling to the ground. The second shattered something in his ribs. He didn't remember the rest. When he woke up, he was in the infirmary, his face swollen, his ribs screaming in pain with every breath. He wasn't a cop anymore. He was just another prisoner. And here, he was nothing. While Paul Henderson rotted away in his cell, the world outside continued without him. Michael Evans stood before a congressional committee, his presence commanding the room. The investigations into police brutality had expanded beyond Brookdale, triggering a national reckoning. Departments across the country were being forced to reckon with their pasts, and systemic reforms were finally being pushed forward. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The problem has never been a few bad apples, Michael said, his voice calm but firm. The problem is the system that allows them to thrive. The problem is the silence that protects them. The problem is the belief that accountability is optional. The cameras flashed, reporters scribbling notes furiously. Congressmen and senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Michael knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something rare: hope. The people were watching. The people were demanding change. And this time, the system couldn't ignore them. Time in prison moved differently. Days blurred together. Weeks turned into months. Paul Henderson lost track of how long he had been inside. At first, he had raged. He had fought back, refusing to believe that this was his reality. Then he had tried bargaining. He had written letters to former colleagues, old friends in the force, anyone who could pull some strings. No one responded. The world had forgotten him. Now, he simply existed. Sitting in his cell one evening, he stared at the cracked concrete wall, his mind drifting. For years, he had told himself that he was a good cop, that he had done what needed to be done, that the people he arrested were criminals, thugs, nobodies. Now, he was the nobody, and he finally understood. All those years, he had justified his actions because the system had let him, because there had been no consequences, because power had shielded him, until he had crossed the wrong man. But the truth was, it shouldn't have taken Michael Evans to bring him down. It shouldn't have taken the head of the FBI being assaulted for the world to care. It should have happened years ago. Paul closed his eyes. For the first time, he truly saw himself for what he was, and it sickened him. 2 years passed. Michael Evans stood in his office, staring out at the Washington skyline. His phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at it. Breaking news: former officer Paul Henderson found dead in his prison cell. He exhaled, feeling neither satisfaction nor sadness. Henderson had always been a man who thrived on control. To be stripped of it, to live as the kind of powerless person he had spent his career tormenting. It was only a matter of time. Michael turned away from the window. The fight wasn't over. There were more Paul Hendersons out there. More men who believed they were untouchable. More systems that protected them. But the world had changed. People were watching now. Justice, long delayed, was finally catching up. And Michael Evans would make sure it never stopped.